The Pound Gap Massacre was shocking on several levels. The fact that both John and his Aunt Jane Mullins were both telling everyone that they did not know who the shooters were cannot be overstressed at this time. Many of the local people had theories about who may have committed the heinous act. These theories were all based upon feuds and other past occurrences, especially Ira's business deals. 5 days after the massacre, in what may have been the greatest shock of all, was the three persons that Jane began accusing. On Thursday, the 19th, Magistrate John Bentley and Wilson Holbrook, the sheriff of Wise County, Virginia, came to Jane's home to question her on the massacre once again. The exact subject of the conversation is unknown. However, it is recorded that upon arrival, Magistrate Bentley basically advised Jane about her Miranda rights. It is also recorded that after the conversation and just before leaving, Jane is told by Magistrate Bentley to, quote, "Tell no one who they were until you have been taken into custody," unquote. However, rumors about Doc Taylor and the Fleming brothers ran rampant in the community over the next 10 days. On the 29th of May, Judge H. A. W. Skeen sent a group of armed men to Kentucky and took Jane and John Mullins into protective custody that would last 6 months. A few days later, just over 3 weeks after the massacre, 4 indictments went out. After the initial investigation, John Bentley and Robert Mullins named 2 suspects based on the ammunition cases that were found at the scene of the crime. Those suspects were Henry Clay Adams and James Potter. On June 3, 1892, warrants were issued for Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor, Henry Clay Adams, and Cal and Samuel Hennon Fleming. Why James Potter is not indicted is unknown, even though his name is brought up in a significant role during the Taylor trial. On June 9th, Judge Lilly, the circuit judge for Perry and Letcher counties in Kentucky, issued a statement. If Taylor and the Fleming brothers set foot in Kentucky, he would send out a party to hang them without judge or jury. This is a highly unusual statement to be made by a judge, and one must ask, why? Sometime after June 3rd, but before Doc Taylor was arrested, Henry Clay Adams went to Gladeville, now Wise, Virginia, and turned himself in. Again, it is important to note, and we cannot overstress the fact, that although the 4 men were indicted on June the 3rd, no arrest warrants have been issued for them. Henry Adams and James Potter were named as suspects because of, quote, "a neat pile of shell casings," unquote, found at what is now being called, quote, "the Killing Rock," unquote, by the local people. These shell casings were 44 caliber, rim-fired, and stamped with the letters U.S. John Bentley and Robert Mullins mistakenly thought that only a certain type of government-issued rifle used this ammunition. These rifles had been used in the Civil War, and although they were supposed to be turned in after the war, many of them were not. Henry and James were both known to possess one of these rifles. We will discuss these rifles and the ammunition casings found at the crime scene in greater detail in the second half of our Killing Rock series titled The Untold Story, Doc's Gun. In addition to the shell casings, Henry Adams was thought to be a suspect because at the time there was a Mullins-Adams feud. Newspapers reported that the feud had become heated a few months prior to the Pound Gap Massacre and that a Mullins man had been killed. We cannot find the exact name of the Mullins man, nor do we know the name of the suspect or the exact date of the crime. Let me assure you that this is not from a lack of trying on our part. However, we do know that a well was poisoned and that a 17-year-old David F. Adams and his brother Henry Clay Adams both became ill with typhoid sometime in late April of that year. David would later die of typhoid, while Henry would recover in early June. According to the daughter of Henry Adams, her father had told her before he died that, quote, he had been very sick for weeks before and after the Pound Gap Massacre, unquote. This matches several stories and legends. On a side note, Henry died in 1935. His death certificate confirms that he died of asthma and the lifetime illness shared by all of those who recover from typhoid. It is our theory that Henry Adams turned himself in because he had a rock-solid alibi. But all that we can prove come from a small newspaper clipping about the arraignment hearing of Henry. We are not told very much about the hearing itself other than that Henry's bail was set at $1,000. We are also told that Henry and Jeff Fleming, the father of the Fleming brothers, got into an argument at the courthouse. We will also be taking a closer look at Henry, the Adams-Mullins feud, and the topic of land squatters in the Untold Story part of the series. Nearly 2 months would lapse before the first recorded and botched arrest attempt would occur. There were many sightings of Dr. M.B. Taylor and the Fleming brothers, but in none of these sightings were they ever described as behaving differently or as men who were on the run. We are often told of a gun battle between Doc Taylor, the Flemings, and the posse sent to arrest them. It is only after this event that Doc Taylor and the Flemings changed their behavior, and from that point on are recorded as men on the run. The story goes that several men were hiding out in the clefts of the Cumberland. Deputy Sheriff John Miller had received word about who the men were, and Doc Taylor and the Fleming brothers were among them. Deputy Miller gathered a posse of 22 men and went to arrest them. The posse approached the site in the open and met no resistance. But according to court testimony, one of the deputies slipped in the mud and his gun went off. This started a battle that ended with Henry Fleming being gravely wounded, but there are no deaths or arrests that day. But this story is not what happened. Dr. Taylor and the Fleming brothers were at the clefts of the Cumberland, and the word received by the sheriff was from the 3 men. Again, we must point out that at this time there had been no arrest warrants issued for Henry Adams, Doc Taylor, or the Fleming brothers. It is also important to note that several stories tell us that Henry Adams was at the clefts of the Cumberland the time of this botched arrest attempt. If this is correct, it means that Henry was out on bail. Why he would be there, we have no idea. But if he was, it sheds a new light as to why Henry went into hiding for 8 years, until the charges against him were dropped in 1901. Newspaper articles from around June 9th tell us that the Fleming brothers and Doc Taylor sent word to Sheriff Holbrook, telling him where they were. This, in fact, would be the first of 3 such letters. In this letter, they state that they will come peaceable, with the condition that they will be allowed to turn state's evidence. The sheriff replies by telling the newspapers that he is too busy to be bothered in an escort at this time. But on July 17th, Sheriff Holbrook sent a posse, led by one of his deputies, to the clefts of the Cumberland to escort Doc Taylor and the Flemings to Gladeville and the Wise Courthouse. The leader of the posse was not Deputy Miller. In fact, we do not know if Deputy Miller ever existed or if he is just a fabrication used to cover up what actually occurred. The leader of the posse was a man by the name of R.D. McFall, an enemy of Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor. This is corroborated by the court record as Sheriff Wilson Holbrook is called as a witness by the defense to testify about the botched arrest attempt. The sheriff had testified that he had appointed R.D. McFall a deputy after McFall had asked to become one. The sheriff went on to state that he had only found out that McFall and Taylor were enemies after the shootout. R.D. McFall and Booker Mullins would both testify that Booker had slipped in the mud and his weapon had discharged. Both testified that Doc Taylor and the Flemings only began shooting at them after Booker's rifle had discharged. Both had tried unsuccessfully to express that Taylor and the Flemings opening fire upon the posse was in some way a surprise to them. Both received a scathing reprimand from the judge. In the letter sent to Sheriff Holbrook by Doc Taylor and the Flemings, they had stated that they had feared for their lives, and that they had been set up. This is corroborated in statements made by Taylor after his arrest. It must be stated again that at the time of the shootout, no arrest warrants had been issued for Henry Clay Adams, Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor, or Calvin and Samuel Hennon Fleming. After this shootout, the three men, and Henry Adams, if he was there, believed that the lawmen were not interested in arresting them, but rather sought their deaths. It is at this time that all four of these men officially went on the run. Dr. Taylor would make his way back to his home in West Virginia and hide out in his attic. The Flemings went into hiding, and it would be nearly 2 years before the brothers were found. And as we already stated, Henry Adams went into hiding for 8 years. Thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we bring to you the history of the Appalachian Mountains. Please like, subscribe, and share below. Also hit the bell for notifications of future videos. And once again, be sure to leave us a "Hey y'all" in the comments section below.